As someone who proudly includes Fate Zero among my favorite anime ever, I tend to get questions regarding why and how I get so much out of such a depressing story. Gen Urobuchi's battle royale is cold and nihilistic and brutal, cutting short the lives of some bright and beautiful characters and leaving many dreams unfulfilled. And people understandably tend to view tragedies like this as disturbing or off-putting, reminding them of the depressing realities of the world in a medium that many use as escapism. So assuming that you aren't masochistic, how could anyone love a story like that? For me at least, part of the answer was that it was a show that made me reflect and learn about myself through learning about the characters. A good amount of the engagement I got from the story came from thinking about the different ideologies and choices that were presented throughout during times that I wasn't actually watching the anime. Of course, Fate Zero isn't the deepest or most complex narrative in the world, but it was more than substantial enough to keep me engaged the entire way through. Regardless of whether or not you're in the camp that thinks of Fate Zero as pretentious, I think that what is beyond doubt is that it is a story whose purpose is to communicate ideas. The question is, how does it do this, and what is it trying to say? To answer that, a little bit of a digression is necessary. To fully understand what Fate Zero is trying to convey, we must first understand the type of story it is stylistically, because these two factors are more intrinsically linked than one would expect. In short, Fate Zero is a form of Greek tragedy. If you're not interested in hearing why I believe this to be the case, feel free to skip to the timestamp on the screen. Now, anyone who has watched Fate Zero knows that it's a bleak story. With the exception of Waver and Ryder, who were important for their role in balancing the story and not allowing it to plunge too deeply into terror, all of the likable characters, or to better define them, the characters that were not overtly mean-spirited or malicious, were left in despair. But tragic events alone cannot form a literary tragedy. As detailed in Mr. AJ Cosplay's video on Fate Zero and tragedies, in ancient Greece, tragedies were not simply stories or plays with sad events within them as they tend to be thought of today, but instead plots that pose the audience with a question. That question usually being, what would you do if you were faced with the decision that these characters had to make? Greek philosopher Aristotle believed that tragedy occurs when the world responds to actions carried out by the prominent characters of a story, and due to this, these questions and the theme of personal choice are always a big factor in Greek tragedies, as they are in Fate Zero. A critical element in tragedy is anagnorisis, defined as a moment in a play or other work when a character makes a critical discovery. In a true tragedy, the hero must realize their mistake and its ramifications. If a character never understands the errors of their ways, the result may be pain and despair, but that does not fulfill the requirements of a literary tragedy. The suffering that a tragic hero experiences is only as potent as it is because of the realization that they were the ones at fault through their own mistakes. Predictably though, this realization always comes too late to prevent the consequences. The Red Wedding in Game of Thrones is not just a Greek tragedy because of the slaughter. It's also because those involved realized the error of their choices, but were helpless to stop the consequences of those errors. In this vein, we can see similarities in Fate Zero. Saber realizes the impact her poor leadership has had on her people and Lancelot too late to truly do anything. Kiritsugu only realizes that his ideals were fundamentally flawed after seeing that the Grail was tainted and willing to destroy half of Fuyuki. Lancer sees how wrong he was to trust in an honorable battle as he stands there dying, and Karya only realizes at the end that his hopeless endeavors were doomed from the beginning. What makes these arcs tragic is not the bloodshed, but that the characters only realized how poor their choices were after the moment to change them had come and gone. There's a distinct pointlessness to it all. Additionally, tragedies tend to have a choir, which represents the message of the gods who comment on what is happening. In classic Greek theater, this tended to be a group of actors or singers who described and commented on the main action of a play with song, dance, or speech. A lot of times, this chorus would make note of tragic irony and character flaws. As such, it was quite meta at times, telling the audience about the holes in the relevant character's way of thinking. In anime and in a story like Fate Zero, the chorus of the choir is the dissenting voices opposing the naive ideals of the characters. For Saber, Kiritsugu, Lancelot, and Ryder's criticism of her ideology is the choir. Kiritsugu's choir is the voice of the Grail, commenting on his mistakes through Irisfeel. Some of the other heroes don't have a concrete choir per se, but the events that happen to them in response to their blind goals are so powerful that it's almost meta in itself. Tragedies have tragic irony, where there is a huge dissonance between what the characters think to be true and what the audience knows to be the case. Partly because it's a prequel, but also just due to the tone and chorus of the story, we know that these people are doomed to fail, but the characters themselves believe that they will succeed. So while this is all reinforcement for the notion that Fate Zero is a Greek tragedy, the most important point here is that a true literary tragedy in the classical sense occurs when the tragic hero or heroes are faced with a decision or ideological problem. And in seeing the course of action that the individual takes, we are given free rein to ponder and comment on their decision, observing it like spectators of a play. This is how Fate Zero approaches storytelling, not necessarily through connecting with the audience on an intimate level, but through investment, intrigue, and reflection. A common criticism of Urobuchi's approach to characterization here is that the characters are more like personifications of ideals rather than genuine human beings. Saber being a character representing honor, Kiritsugu being a form of utilitarianism, Gilgamesh embodying hedonism, Kirei championing nihilism, etc. Now, I can't really say that I agree with this criticism, as in general it tends to ignore both context and the nuances and subtleties in the cast's characterization, but I do find it interesting because it is indicative of a stylistic element in Urobuchi's writing that borrows from classic Greek tragedy. It is true that in Fate Zero, ideologies are of utmost importance when it comes to the characters. But consistent with the structure of ancient theater, these ideologies are not there for us to relate to them. We may be able to relate to the characters, and I personally can relate to a few of them, but that isn't the point. Instead, we're supposed to observe and put ourselves in their shoes and learn. The narrative never presents any one philosophy or ideology as right or wrong, but simply lays them out and leaves it for the audience to reflect on what they think and what they adhere to, just as a true tragedy does. So when questioning what Fate Zero is trying to say, why is it important to establish that it is indeed a Greek tragedy? It all comes down to the setting and premise of the work. The Holy Grail War is an appropriate event to establish an exciting premise, while also remaining consistent with the elements of that type of story. Placing ancient heroes in a setting with regular humans is a plot tool that lends itself both to classic tragedy and contemporary entertainment. But while the Holy Grail War is vital in this structural way, it is just as important thematically. A battle royale with a stunning wish-granting device as a prize is the optimal backdrop for a glorious tournament. In a scenario like this, you can't really begrudge the participants for getting carried away and romanticizing their expectations, because the situation itself is so evocative of the stereotypical triumphant war tale. And this is why Fate Zero is so effective, because it is the perfect premise for a beautiful, idealized, cookie-cutter battle full of honor and glory, yet as a result of this, it's also extremely powerful at throwing these notions in the trash and displaying the harsh truths and pointlessness of war. It's only because this premise instills so much hope and blind faith in our characters that their inevitable fall is so impactful. And in realizing that they were wrong all along, these people are left absolutely devastated, while those on the black side of the moral spectrum were left smiling. It's one of the bluntest displays of the harsh truths of war that I've ever seen.
A knight cannot save the world. Knights call certain methods of fighting good, and others evil, acting as if there were some sacred nobility to the battlefield. Such illusions, created by heroes throughout history, have led countless young men to their bloody deaths, all for the sake of this glory and honor they all extol.
They are not illusions! Even the taking of a life in battle, as an act of a human being, must have ideals! Otherwise every war would bring the very fires of hell to this world!
And there you go. You heard her, Irie. Our heroic spirit over there considers a battlefield to be better than hell. What a joke. A battlefield is hell itself.
Extending from this, Fate Zero also claims that there are no miracles in the world that can bring about world peace or an end to conflict. This is just the way of the world. It'll always be ugly to some extent, and as presented through the taking apart of Kiritsugu's ideals within the Grail, it can't be saved from all suffering. Kiritsugu is deluded. Death just breeds more death, and no amount of extreme utilitarian ethics can be justified through an easy, mindless miracle. As long as mankind is prevalent, bloodshed will be prevalent. However, accepting the true nature of the world is the first step to finding meaning and not getting shrouded in darkness. The world can be miserable at times, but that is never going to change. So why not try to find a happy place within it, as Waver sets out to do? It might be a struggle, but for many, the struggle ends up being worth it. Having said that, some struggles are in vain, such as the ones displayed in the show as being fought for the sake of so-called honor. However, it's important to note that while war is presented in a derogatory way through both Saber and Lancer's misplaced optimism and Kiritsugu's chastising of it, Ryder offers a more positive take on the idea related to finding purpose in glory and sacrifice itself to give some balance to the issue. However, with the narrative being centered much more on the former interpretation, it's clear what the message is, and it's one of the few times that Urobuchi puts emphasis on one line of thinking more than others. But as important and poignant of a theme as the pointlessness of war is, there is a subtler yet just as significant concept that can be parsed out of the narrative by the end. A common interpretation of one of Urobuchi's other works, Psycho-Pass, is that it's a warning of the consequences of a dystopian future and an advocate for societal harmony through the avoidance of extremes. And although Fate Zero is quite different from Psycho-Pass in terms of its themes, I think that it follows a similar framework. In some ways, Fate Zero is a commentary and warning on the dangers of idealization. The very fact that the darker, more pragmatic characters with far less to lose were the happy ones by the end is in itself a demonstration that idealists by design tend to put themselves in much more precarious positions than realists or nihilists. Now, this can be interpreted as Urobuchi trying to nudge the audience into succumbing to pure nihilism, but I don't think that the message here has to be quite as depressing as that. As much as one could look at the story and be discouraged or repulsed by the way it dismisses the validity of its characters' romantic ideals, I don't believe that that is what Fate Zero is about. Or at least, this isn't the only way to view it. As we see through the character journeys of both Ryder and Waver, the story never intends to disregard ideals and the beauty of genuine spirit entirely. All of the tragedy that occurred was not due to the presence of ideals, but instead due to an over-reliance on them. The characters were possessed of a hopeless naivete, an immature notion that things would turn out alright as long as they stuck to their plan, but they never really took a chance to try and view things from another, more realistic perspective. Kiritsugu's belief that the Grail would end all suffering was essentially nothing more than hot air, fueled by a desperate hope that all he had sacrificed was not in vain. Saber's ideals seemed completely sound to her until hearing thoughts on the issue from those who could poke holes in her logic all day. But by the time she understood, the time for redemption, in this story at least, was long gone. None of the characters seemed capable of taking a step back and looking at their ideals through a critical lens. None believed, or wanted to believe, that there was a possibility that they were flawed. A little bit of perspective and realism would have done wonders, and that is what the story is demonstrating. Not that there is no place for idealism in the world, but that, as with all things in life, there must be balance. By extension, this message can be construed as a bit of advice for how to pursue real-life endeavors. Don't ever full-out ignore idealism. Strive for your goals. Set lofty ambitions and don't limit your ceiling. Believe in yourself. Live instinctually and be passionate. But at the same time, and this is where the story's warning comes in, be realistic. Have fallback options, and don't be afraid to anticipate failure or the idea that you could be wrong. Always question yourself and be willing to accept that your way may not be best, because with the right mindset, failure is the optimal stimulus for growth and learning. In essence, Fate Zero's primary goal involves juggling and presenting many different ideas and philosophies for the audience, while demonstrating how they can clash and contrast with one another. The investment it establishes in its characters and the questions it poses to the audience through its Greek tragedy structure only serve to reinforce its points. It juxtaposes the heavy emotion of the story with the way it invites the audience to ponder and reflect on its ideas to form what I found to be a very potent combination. Of course, being a person who is shaped in many ways by this show, I myself may be lacking some of the oh-so-important balance that I was talking about earlier, so please feel free to share your opinions of what this show meant to you in the comments. Cheers to everyone for watching, and stay tuned for more.
Tell me, Carrie, what do you want to grow up to be?
Well, what I want to be is a hero.